We live in a golden age of digital media content. From podcasts to blogs and online programs, there's never been so much competition for the information consumer's attention. Today's guest brings humor and a mastery of pop culture to some of today's most pressing issues. She's Elisa Kreisinger this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University. Alongside me is my friend and co-host, G. Wayne Miller of the Providence Journal. Story in the Public Square is an effort to study, celebrate, and tell stories that matter. To do that, we sit down every week with the best storytellers around, filmmakers, authors, journalists, and more, to make sense of the big stories that shape public life in the United States today. To help us this week, we're joined by Elisa Kreisinger, a writer, producer, and podcaster that her bio says makes her a pop culture pirate. Elisa, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you guys for having me.
So, pop culture pirate, what exactly does that mean?
There comes a time in every woman's life where you have to choose a URL and a domain name. And for me, that name came from that very special time in a woman's life where I too had to choose a domain name. And the idea behind it was just, I read this feminist theorist at the time. I was in college, and she said that in order for women to survive in society, they had to loot and plunder from culture, take what they needed, and disregard the rest. And I thought that that was really apt for storytelling and media making. And so I figured, I'd be the pop culture pirate.
So what drew you to storytelling yourself?
That's a great question. I think I really like connecting the dots. I love asking questions. Usually I'm on this side of the table.
Feel free to ask us a question.
I will. Yeah. I do have a list.
We don't want a whole list.
Yeah. I love connecting the dots and taking these big questions that I have, that we all have at like 4 a.m., and putting the pieces of the puzzle together and then kind of regurgitating that in a way that makes sense to an audience. And now with digital media, makes it super shareable and accessible and fun. And I, one day want to be like the John Oliver with a top knot, I'm going for that kind of idea of how do we make these big things that we all struggle with really accessible. And so that's kind of how I got into storytelling.
So a little bit of your background. You have a huge following, so a lot of our audience members will know about you, know you. Some won't. So you grew up in New Jersey, is that correct? And then you went to the college you mentioned, which was Simmons. So tell us that story.
Sure. So I grew up in New Jersey. I went to public school. I played sports, a lot of sports. I was a competitive figure skater, was skating before school in the morning. I was captain of varsity swim team. I was on the softball team. I was on varsity swimming. I realize now, though, looking back, that like all I wanted from those sports was just an audience. Like,
really?
Yeah.
You're ham.
I I wouldn't go that far because I'm not sure I was that successful at it. But like,
you were an aspiring ham.
Yeah. Like
I ham aspirant.
Exactly. Yes. So I just like the idea of like group settings where I could like work on a tight 5 set. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
And then, like that was my thing. I loved making the girls on traveling team crack up, on the bench or during batting practice or whatever. That to me, like, yeah, making women laugh was like something that I really aspired to. So my childhood had a ton of sports in it, but I'm like okay athletically. Really, it was about having an audience and, yeah, making people laugh.
I mean, you're obviously hilarious. Were you funny even before sports?
I
was
don't
this something
know,
like we find?
Was it a blow to the head?
No. I mean, like if we look at the home movies when you were 5, were you entertaining family and friends and making them laugh?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have siblings, so really it was my parents. But my whole life was documented. It's called Elisa Day by Day. It's on VHS in our basement, and it is, yeah, a record of my childhood that is documented. My birth is documented on audio. My father wanted to bring in a VHS, you know, like the old school VHS cameras into the delivery room, and they were like, you can't do that. Like, this was 1986, and they're like, you can't bring that in here. So he recorded it all on an audio tape. So yeah, my life is highly documented. Am I like performing for people? Nah, like kind of. It's my parents though, so they're kind of biased. I think like I had a very, you know, lively internal world, and yeah, that's where I started. Yeah. Yeah.
So you went to Simmons, which is a highly respected all-women's university in Boston. Why an all-girls school?
So I tried out an all-girls high school my freshman year of high school. My parents thought that like sending me to an all-girls high school was going to be this feminist awakening, that, you know, I was going to be not encouraged by boys to be a certain way or do a certain thing. I was just going to be able to be myself. But it was an all-girls Catholic school, and like back to school night was like a fundraiser for pro-life, and they were just like, this is not the feminist agenda we thought we were paying for. Why Catholicism and feminism didn't connect for them, I don't know. But they really thought that it was going to be this big feminist awakening. So when it came to college, I think that there was, you know, they really wanted me to go someplace where I could learn to be a critical thinker, and Simmons seemed like a great place to do that.
But those feminist values were important to you before you got to Simmons.
I mean, my parents were political, but when your parents are giving you kind of like punk feminist zines, it's just like it loses its cachet. You know what I mean? Like I was so anti-authoritarian that I said no to the feminist punk rock zines because your parents are giving them to you.
Yeah.
So you majored in communications and women's studies. What drew you to those individually and then collectively?
Well, women and gender studies gave me a lens through which to view the world. So it was like putting on a pair of glasses and I could see the world through a certain lens. And that was really helpful because with media, you need a point of view. And so with communications and media, that gave me a platform to have a perspective and a point of view. So that seemed to work really well together. I think I really came to appreciate studying women and gender studies because it encourages you to look at the absurd and look at the patterns within society and culture. And that is inherently funny. Like just looking at the discrepancy between things is funny and bizarre and amusing. And that's where a lot of humor comes from. That's why those two things kind of meshed for me. It was part and parcel of the same process.
So we're going to get into your later career in just a minute here. Did you, while you were at Simmons, begin to develop a career path or a plan? You want to be such and such a place in 5 years, 10 years? And what were you thinking?
I was thinking so many things. I feel like when you're 18, 19, 20, 21, you have so many grand ideas about what your life is going to be like, your aspirations, and that is so important to have. At the same time, reality is so bad, so terrible. I graduated into the recession, so I graduated in 2008, right as the stock market crashed. Total bad timing. But I knew that I wanted to work in media. I really wanted to work in TV and movies, but I also knew, again, like going to Simmons and having this kind of feminist education, we had watched documentaries, books, like this was so obviously 10 years before Me Too, but like you just knew that it was a hotbed for harassment. Like you didn't go into TV and movies as a woman and think like, oh, I'm going to have a great artistic career. You know going in you're going to be harassed and have a lot to put up with. So I was so afraid of going in that direction, and my first job out of college was as a PA on a Martin Scorsese set for Shutter Island. And Marty was wonderful, everybody was wonderful, but you just it was a hard set to be on for a variety of reasons, and you know, a lot of friendships were broken and a guy died, and it was just like a really, you know, everybody who went on to work with Marty before and after says like, God, that was a really bad set, and that was my first one. So that mixed with this idea of like going into TV and movies, you are just gonna get eaten alive. I think after that I thought, I'm not sure this is for me, so I just worked in nonprofit work, and Was that what I saw for myself in college? No, but I kind of hit the reality of what working in this arena would look like, and I just tried to pivot a little bit to what I thought would be self-sustaining for my ego and my identity and my ability to sustain myself kind of as a media maker. It was like a lot more psychological.
So I want to pick up on something you said. You know, you talked about graduating in 2008, which is, you know, really a decade before Me Too really became a phenomena. But there being a general awareness of the BS that women had to put up with in that industry.
Not just the BS.
And what? So what do you think made what was the trigger moment? Was it the reporting by somebody like Ronan Farrow who was shining a light? Was it the willingness of women to come forward and say, yes, these powerful men have been doing horrible things? Mm-hmm. What finally happened in 2017 that made Me Too happen? Well,
I mean, I'm certainly not an expert because I am not in the industry like those women are. I did have an opportunity to interview Rosanna Arquette, who was one of the women mentioned in Ronan's piece, and everybody says this, and me as an outsider who was trying to get into that industry even knew it's an open secret. Everybody talks about the harassment. You just know going in, you know that you're going to be harassed. You know that there's going to be drunken phone calls. Like, you just know that this is the stuff that's going to go down. I mean, and that's me as a PA who has no power whatsoever. You know what I mean? So it's, I think it hit. So what happened in 2017? I don't know, other than people were willing to talk about it, and it had been an open secret for so long that I think the rise of digital media meets a story that had been brewing under the surface for years and years and years, and you finally had a moment that hit its kind of viral peak. I also think the reporting by the New York Times and Jodi Kantor and her reporting partner to obviously break the Harvey Weinstein story, I think it was October of 2017 now.
It was.
I mean,
the New Yorker and New York Times came out the same week.
Right,
and they shared the Pulitzer Prize.
Right.
For investigative reporting.
So the fact that you have this, first of all, the fact that you have two legacy publications coming to do it together is huge. They didn't tear each other down, and I think that had a lot to do with where the state of media is now. You have two legacy publications who are fighting to be heard and understood and taken seriously among the rise of digital, where everybody's like, oh, you're old school, you're legacy, you don't matter anymore. Well, look who kind of rises to the top and who has the resources to do independent reporting and investigation to have a sea change within culture. And obviously, I think the political climate as well of calling out fake news and delegitimizing news also had a role to play as well, because you're forced to bring your A game as the New Yorker and the Times. I mean, now's the time. What better time than now to do real, perfect reporting? So I think that all three of those kind of came to head at the right moment.
You were the host of this brilliant video podcast, Strong Opinions Loosely Held.
Yeah, can you write that down for the brilliant part so I get that notarized?
Yeah, right after the show.
Yeah, thank
we have
you.
a notary public right in front.
Okay, great.
So,
one of your early episodes of that podcast asked that question about whether or not you could separate the artist from the art, whether or not it mattered that these movies that people have loved and these shows that people have loved are forever ruined because we now know that their stars, their directors, their producers were doing awful things.
Sure, yeah.
Where ultimately did you come down on that?
So, whether or not you can separate the art from the artist, I mean, I don't think you can separate the art from the artist. They are one and the same, because just like, when we talk about where our coffee comes from, where we talk about where our jeans are sourced, our clothing, is it fair trade, our meat, is it hormone antibiotic free, where was it raised? All of these things kind of matter to what we put in our bodies and in our psyches. And if we're putting in stuff that is made with a certain, again, I go back to this lens of the way we view women. Also, by the way, now, looking back, so many of those sex scenes we know were coerced. I mean, we don't need to name names and go into specifics, but can you separate the art from the artist? In my opinion, no. And it only gives more, to me, it gives more respect for the women who put up with that stuff, both behind the scenes and the actors who were in the scenes as well.
So viewers should know that, and I think Jim and I would completely agree. But the works that they were in, and let's take, for example, House of Cards and Kevin Spacey.
Yeah.
Should those works continue to be streamed or shown or available?
I think yes, because then we get to view them with a new lens. We get to, I mean, if it's taken off the shelf, we don't get the opportunity to reassess what happened. Now we get to look through House of Cards through the lens of what was happening in that scene, what happened before and after that scene. We get to read the reports along. It's just another piece of the puzzle. And I think that that's really important in any kind of cultural, creative endeavor. You get to see all sides of the story.
How did you get to podcasting? Because that's really where you've made your name. I mean, other places too, but that's really where you've made your name.
Yeah.
What drew you to that, and at what point in your career development did you go, that's the venue where I want to make?
There weren't a lot of women's voices there, to be honest. Podcasting, at the time when I started anyway, was heavily dominated by men.
When was this? Give us a year.
This was in 2016.
Okay, so dominated by men?
Yeah,
Fair
a lot
statement.
of the voices, literally, I mean, the voices that you heard were men's voices. And there was a lot of critique of women's voices. So when you were listening to a podcast and somebody up-talked or talked like this, and every end of the sentence was a question, you know, anytime a woman went on air, they were critiqued for the sound of their voice. So naturally, one of the first episodes we did was on critiquing women's voices, but the importance to me was that, like, hey, here's an industry that hasn't really been totally cracked open yet. How can we have fun and play here? There's obviously women who are listening, so is there a way that we can appeal to them in an interesting way that these other shows aren't?
And you describe your show as being, you know, based on the internet's biggest threat, smart, opinionated women.
Yeah.
But the critique that you mentioned about the way women might end a sentence with an inflection up in their voice, we see this now with this new raft of female Democratic candidates for president.
Oh, yeah.
And some of the coverage, even out of the gate, sort of seems like nobody has learned any of the lessons from 2016.
Yeah.
And they're focusing on really sort of the most ridiculous kinds of questions about, well, what did they eat? And how did they eat it? And did they know how to eat barbecue?
Yeah, I know.
Why is this still happening?
Yeah, why
Boy, wouldn't we like to know
why
why?
haven't people
If you have the answer,
their...
by the way, you're coming back on this show every week.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think two reasons. One, why do we assume that people are exempt from the racism and misogyny that's all around in our culture and don't just copy and paste it onto new media, right? Like, we're not exempt from the water we're swimming in, and so it's very easy to just copy paste that stuff because you've seen it before, and that's the narrative that you're going to go with. In a 24-hour news cycle and in clickbait headline culture, we want clicks and we want people to be able to screenshot it and put it up on Instagram and either call it out as so crazy. Like, a lot of that stuff is just like, this is crazy, we know we are going to get flack for this, but that's better than no attention at all. Mm-hmm. So I think it is unfortunate, but it does get attention, whether it be positive or negative.
So we watched some of these podcasts, and they're universally great. I wanted to get into a couple of them. One is, why is women's pain taken less seriously?
Yeah.
Which is a significant topic and something not often explored. What's the answer?
Yeah, so we started the podcast in 2016, and it was a way to get women's voices into this industry. And then the podcast did really well. It was top 10 in iTunes, and we were just so excited to see us have an audience. Like, you don't really know when you launch something if anyone's going to care, and people cared.
Did you have a sense of who was watching? Was it female, male, a mix, young, old?
Yeah, early on, I mean, iTunes is really bad with demographic, or Apple Podcasts, and they rebranded themselves to be Apple Podcasts, and they're notoriously bad with demographic information, but it's safe to say it was majority women leaving comments and reviews and things like that.
But why is women's pain taken less seriously?
So we had this podcast, and then it got really popular, and we made it into a video series, and then we had to add a visual component to it as well. So you're taking these large topics, and then not only do you have to dissect them down in 5 minutes, but add a visual component to them as well. And so with why is women's pain taken less seriously, that was a topic that constantly kind of came up in the background of the podcast, and we decided to do it in video form because we had this wonderful source and professor who was diagnosed with lupus later on in life after she struggled trying to get attention for her symptoms her whole life. And it wasn't until she went to school and had a doctor in her college health center, took her file home and pieced things together herself and was like, I think you have lupus, which is like a huge autoimmune disease. So why is women's pain taken less serious? Throughout this episode, we kind of dissect this idea that the medical industry and community isn't taught about society at all. They have no kind of empathy towards people who come from different backgrounds or cultures, or are women and not men. Like there's so many studies that aren't done on women's bodies. They're just like the default is like a guy. So there's just a lot of I think there was a lot of miscommunication when talking about pain and who feels pain. And how women feel pain. And there's a ton of stats around this as well. And so to answer your question, which is I'm long-winded to say why is women's pain taken less seriously, is because the majority of doctors are male and they don't understand the pain that women are in, and it is inherently taken less seriously because people don't take women seriously. And I'm boiling this down to like its basic level, but
there's a mounting body of research that confirms this, including here at Brown University, their medical school. They've got some top-flight people, women who are looking at this issue. And
let me take this in a slightly different direction. So you've worked professionally in sort of digital media. How do you make a living in digital media?
How much time do we have left? What kind of answer do you want?
A funny one would be great, but we'll take whatever you got.
How do you make a living in digital media? You know that you inherently work in a dysfunctional industry. You don't take that dysfunction on personally like it is you. And I ask for what you're worth. I think those would be like my 3 big takeaways. Digital media is in a really hard spot right now, and we're seeing the fluctuations of what that looks like. Ann Helen Peterson wrote a great article about burnout culture and what burnout culture looks like when you're working in digital media. It's difficult, but if you cannot take personally the craziness that is the industry, then I think that will set many of us up for a future, hopefully, when things stabilize out later. I mean, again, many of us graduated into the recession, and now 10 years later, we're in our 30s, and we are now in a digital media funk. So we are unfortunately very used to these up and downs.
But it seems like there's incredible pressure to produce these incredibly sophisticated, professionally produced products, but with, I'm assuming in most cases, no money, no budget, no staff. Right?
Yes, you are right. You said it, not me. Yeah, for sure. I mean, for Strong Opinions, we would shoot 8 episodes at a time, and the goal is to just not make it look like you're working that much or that hard to create what that gets exported as, for sure. Yes, do more with less. And I think that is a trend of digital media, and I don't know how or when that changes, because I look at any other industry and they're also being asked to do more with less.
We always like to talk about craft. We don't have nearly enough time to get into it in any depth with you now. But this is sort of a non-craft question. With all the frustrations and the pressures of podcasting and digital storytelling, what do you do mentally to sort of step away and refresh yourself, recharge the batteries, encourage yourself to go on, get away, whatever it is?
So that's a good question. I think, so Strong Opinions won a bunch of awards. I go back and I read through the awards and just the stuff that we accomplished. It was a Digiday Award winner. It was a Webby honoree. Just to know that like all the work that you're doing pays off in the form of these things that are tangible. So much of digital media and digital culture isn't tangible. You can't hold it in your hand. It's ephemeral. It goes away in 24 hours. But you can see an award, and that validation, like I know people say, you know, don't do it for the awards, but to be able to see something tangible, that to me is really helpful. So that's not like the modest answer perhaps you were looking for, but just to get validation, I think is really important for many of us in this space who don't get it often from the world or the culture they're working in.
Well, we will validate your work because it's brilliant. So
thank you.
We do. You are validated.
I'm gonna,
Story in the Public Square.
Seriously, can you please sign? I brought an autograph book for you both to sign and date that,
We'll
please.
do that after the show.
Thank you very much.
Elisa Kreisinger, thank you so much for being with us. That's all the time we have this week, but if you want to know more about Story in the Public Square, you can find us on Facebook or Twitter. He's Wayne, I'm Jim, asking you to join us again next week for more Story in the Public Square.